wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
So welcome to another edition of Globespan 24x7. Tonight, March 22nd, Wednesday evening. We are discussing or continuing our discussion on ethnic relations, fostering social cohesion in the era of oil and gas in Guyana. Discussing our topic tonight, our three very distinguished personalities. As usual, we have Professor Terrence Blackman of Medgaffers College of the City University of New York, Mr. Timothy Jonas from ANUG, who's chairperson of ANUG, usual presence on Globespan, but although not in recent times, we have missed him. Welcome back, Timothy. And we have Mr. Leyland Roopnarine, a real estate agent in New York, and a regular visitor to Guyana, and who was involved in political struggle in Guyana for decades, going back into the 60s through the 1990s. So welcome all, gentlemen. Thank you for taking your time out of your very, very busy schedule tonight to join us to discuss this very important topic. Let's begin first with Professor Terrence Blackman, he being the professor among us, to give us a little introduction into this topic.
Well, thank you, Vishnu, and good evening, colleagues. And it's a pleasure, as always, to join with you folks on Globespan to engage in what I think is a very important conversation to help, in some sense, to catalyze social cohesion within the context of Guyana and more broadly within the context of the sort of Guyanese diaspora. I think I wanted to be clear that when we talk about social cohesion, we're talking about the degree of connectedness, the degree of solidarity among sort of Guyanese in the society, right? So that's the broad measure of, how connected are we? How in solidarity are we? And as we talked about in the last program, we saw that social cohesion is not an easy thing, right? It relies on a number of factors, and I think we articulated in the last discussion factors such as shared values and trust and social networks that we're a part of. And then the conversation, in a sense, broke down over the question of these shared values. And so, tonight I hope that we can re-engage around, in some sense, defining some shared Guyanese values, defining some things that would move Guyanese more to trust, as we saw, over the course of the last 2 weeks in our Guyanese polity, the question of the WPA and what was said at some of the meetings and what were the implications for what was said at some of the meetings and how we ought to reconstitute the polity after what has been said, and how do we facilitate the kind of trust across various groups to understand that we're all part of this thing called Guyana. I have to say tonight, as I was inviting some colleagues to come and listen to the program, I mean, they're a strong thing. It said, Dr. Blackman, you need to stop that nonsense. We're not going to have this kind of solidarity and cohesion that you think we ought to have, and this person doesn't want that, and so I mean, my hope is that we can have a conversation about this in a way that maintains a certain kind of tone, that maintains a certain kind of respect, that allows us to listen and hear listen with empathy and hear what other folks are saying. But at the end of the day, to sort of drive to a place where we look at those values that we share, where we think about ways in which we can foster more trust so that, we're not reflexively reacting in a negative way to everything that is being said, and that we can strengthen our social networks. So, I'll start with that and then listen to my colleagues.
I thank you for that explanation and definition of social cohesion. Before we go into the comments related to what the WPA people said, let's hear from our colleagues as well about the definition. Let's just focus for now the definition, whether you agree, disagree, what you'd like to add, delete on social cohesion. So let's ask the council. Timothy, Jonas.
The expression social cohesion doesn't say anything about race. And I want to be very clear that we must not sidestep an issue or pretend it doesn't exist. If you are looking to solve a problem, you have to first identify the problem, identify its parameters and its source. And unless you can do that frontally, without any mirrors, without any smoke, you missed the boat already. So I got the impression from what my friend Dr. Blackman was saying that apparently there's been a previous disagreement in a forum discussing social cohesion. I have not seen previous programs on it, so I may be wrong about that. I agree that you have to, if possible, conduct your conversation showing respect for another view and listening with an open mind to the other view, because it's only by fully understanding all perspectives that we can then identify problems, sources of problems, and solving problems. That being said, if I see a racist, I call him a racist. And I think that part of the problem we have in Guyana is the willingness you see, and I'll point to the political parties, to shake hands and hug up people that have been racist, expressed racist views, have done dishonest things. And the next day you say, oh, this person is my friend. I have a problem with that. That is part of the cowardice in our society that allows the ugly, brutish side of things to perpetuate and escalate.
Leyland? Leyland?
Well, welcome viewers. The topic tonight is a rather strange one, fostering social cohesion in an era of oil and gas. The issue of social cohesion has been there long before oil and gas, long before rice, sugar. In fact, social cohesion has been an issue since we were dirt poor and a third world rice republic. The issue of social cohesion has mainly to do with race in Guyana. But many of our viewers would like to think that Guyana's most serious problem is race. I don't think so. I think Guyana's most serious problem is theft. And what I say this is simple. People are not born racist. They acquire these traits because of the behavior of other people. And racism only raises its ugly head at election time in this country. If you go to the cricket ground, we all will cheer when our people are batting and making runs and getting wickets, regardless of their race. In order for us to solve this problem, first we have to identify what the problems are in Guyana. And racism is another problem that can be solved. What racism is an ugly monster that you need to curb, and you need to address the effects of what it will cause. And you have to create a condition whereby all races can acquire their full potential in whatever field they choose, without being restricted for the simple fact that they belong to a particular ethnic group. It so happens that the Ghanaian electoral system allows the people to legally elect a dictator, because The past two governments have only won by one seat, the narrow margins, one seat in parliament. Yet they have ruled as if they are overwhelmingly voted in by the population. Unless we have a change in this constitutional system and the structure of governance, Ghana will never ever see any form of social cohesion.
All right, so we have the parameters of this concept of social cohesion. We have two short video clippings. Devin, can you just show them, and then we'll have reactions, commentaries from our three distinguished guests.
Who suddenly get in land. Many of them came from the slums of India. And if you look at the amount of persons in India, 1.something billion to that little landmass, you understand what is going on in India. They lived in pipes, they live in all the deplorable places, and the few high ones in the high caste, they live in the top places like Delhi and the big high Punjab province and that place. That is only place for the elite. A white diplomat pulled me in a corner and he said, I don't understand how people complaining that they are oppressed and they have all the guns in their hands. They are the majority in the army, the majority in the police, and they're still saying they are oppressed. What he was saying, that our problem is of our own making. Our problem is our own making. Anytime we turn those guns in the right direction, it is over.
Okay, so it appears that's the end of it. Clearly, the two speakers uttered rather ignorant remarks. So I wonder if I could just get your views on them. Let's start with the professor, Professor Terrence Blackman of Medgar College, CUNY.
Thank you. So I'll address the first speaker. You see, again, this what I see here. There are two things. There are two levels at which I want to address this. First is such a factual level. You know, anyone who's visited India, as I have, you know, knows that India is a big, diverse society, huge society with many aspects to it, right? It can't be simplified and reduced in the manner that. So that's the first level. Just on a purely factual level, what is being said is, but it's on the second level. What is being said is part of some, and as we have discussed here, it's part of a kind of ethnic contestation that is happening on an ongoing basis in Guyana, and it's sort of metastasizing, as I see it, into these kinds of outbursts that don't bring us any closer together. You know, this is the kind of speech that, you know, we all ought to say has no place in the public discourse in Guyana. There should be no, we should unequivocally say this kind of speech has no place in the public discourse, and we should aim to send serious condemnation to this kind of speaking. You know, I think more serious is the second speaker, and I think, you see, and maybe I'm seeing it from a distance, and so I can see it with a perspective that is not perhaps evident to, you know, people who are in Guyana and who perhaps feel more entitled to say such a thing. But, you know, I will say from a distance that this kind of inflammatory rhetoric is extremely dangerous, particularly at this moment. You know, as Lena noted, I mean, and as both Timothy noted, you know, the question is, we understand this question of race and the way in which the contestation between the two major racial groups mediated through these political parties that represent them kind of condition us in a particular manner. But we've always, I think, held on to the fact that we haven't had any coups. We haven't had any sort of military takeovers. And I think to raise the specter of that, and this is where I think maybe Leyland, you and I mean, when we were poor, it didn't matter. So, but I think now that it is wealthier, it really does matter. And people are more willing to do some of those things. And so, yeah, and I think it's the kind of speech that one ought to put severely sanctioned, to say, you know, you can't call for the people who are part of the armed services to turn their guns against the elected, the elected government of the state. And I want to stress. So again, to Timothy's point, the conversation, to Timothy's query earlier, the conversation that we were last having between Ravi Dev and David Hines broke down on precisely this issue. David Hines felt that somehow the question was, if you're in a democracy, you have to hold to the rules. Democracy has to be one of our shared values. We can't halfway step democracy. We have to either say we're a democracy and we agree with the will of the people as expressed by the votes and expressed by the counting of the votes, or if we're not that, then we're something else and it's not quite clear what we are then. And, you know, Dr. Hines said, well, you know, before this democracy, there has to be some dignity. And he went to the issues of the various incidents of, you know, squatters being bulldozed from their houses and other things in which the state had kind of, in his way, infringed in a very serious way on the dignity of Afro-Guyanese. And he said, well, you know, you can't ask me to go and look for crossover votes if this is happening. And so this is where the conversation literally broke down. And I think these speeches, in some sense, are a reflection of that. If you have a democracy, if people are going to vote to elect, then political parties and their representatives can't stand in the public and say to the armed forces that you ought to turn your guns against the elected political representatives, right? This is out of bounds, it seems to me. Maybe I'm far away and so I'm not close enough, so I don't understand it. So I'm willing to hear what Mr. Jonas and Mr. Roopnarine say in this regard, because I might be perhaps too far out on the ledge here. But this is out of bounds, it seems to me.
Yeah, I am in agreement with you that both statements ought to be condemned. The first one is total nonsense, as you rightly stated. Anyone who visited India, it's not factual. And in fact, I just returned from India only yesterday, and India is quite different from the mind of this person. He may be thinking about 60 years ago, but not the India of today. And the second one, you know, it's very inflammatory to call for violence against people based on ethnicity or on any other factor or condition. And one has to respect the democratic outcome of a society. Now, you then just get to choose who you want to rule because you don't like a democratic outcome. Timothy Jonas of a new and united Guyana.
Thanks, Vish. You called me the chairman. I'm not the chairman anymore. Let me make that very small point.
Okay. All right,
General
okay.
Secretary, I've changed seats, changed hats. But,
okay.
Okay, I'd like to talk about the two statements separately. I'd been asked and I'd spoken about the second statement before. And let us separate fact from innuendo, fact from what the speaker was trying to say. I don't know who the speaker was. I got the impression she was female, not male. The voice was high, but I don't know who the speaker was. As you and Terrence have pointed out, the factual statement is nonsensical. Trying to isolate Delhi from somewhere else. Delhi's a city, it's got its slums, it's got its rich, it's got its poor. But what that speaker was doing wasn't to talk about India, but to denigrate the Indians who came over here during the indentureship period. So what the speaker was trying to do is to say these people are worthless because they are really the dregs of that society. They're the poor, the unwanted, the outcasts from that society who are coming here. So she was seeking to express a sneering contempt for the Indian men and women who came and adopted Guyana and became Guyanese and became one with us. Now, the thing is, factually, there's truth in this statement. The wealthy folk from India didn't come here. The people who came here were the people who were looking for a new life and who had to get up and go to say, well, things aren't working where I am. Let me go and see if the grass is greener somewhere else. But the equally true fact that was ignored by the speaker is that this fiction that is kings and queens and princes of Africa that came over to the New World is just as nonsensical. So we need to speak another truth. When slaves were caught in Africa, they were the losers. They were the people who lost the internal wars, who were captured from weaker tribes, who were the outcasts, who were snatched away. It wasn't the kings and the queens and the princes that came over here. So if we want to draw a parallel, I would say that the people who came to this new world from both sides need to be very thankful that we have a new world and a new society in which we have an opportunity to lift ourselves up. So if we are going to castigate one side, I think from the factual point of view, we got to look at both sides. The second aspect of what she said, which is a point I made in another forum, is that if these ne'er-do-wells, these no good people from the bottom of the society, the scrapings from the bottom of the barrel came over here, after us, and raised themselves up socially, economically, politically, so that we have Gaffurs and Bpats and Tulsi Prasads, and you can go down the list, Biharis and Sankars, and down the list. And in the professions, we have Ram Sohoy, and we have the doctors, and we have all of these people who lifted themselves up. Then you really got to ask yourself serious questions. So for me, I think that if we have to face frontally the facts, let us all agree that we came to this new world starting over. There's no blue blood here. We all got red blood. We're all ordinary. And we need to be judged individually on our merits and our achievements and our accomplishments. But more importantly to me, on our charity and our kindness and how we deal with others in the society and how we look after our own families and raise each other up. And that speaker there, to me, is the worst of the worst, because she relies on facts which are not factual. She draws conclusions without any premise which seek to denigrate a whole group of people identified as a race in Guyana. And she seeks to condemn them and denigrate them on no basis whatsoever. And she has no reason for doing so, except race. And you can't whitewash that, you can't make that look better than it is. That's the worst kind of harm we have in our society.
Shall we go to Leyland and then you could come back and comment on the second speaker? Let's do that. Leyland?
Yeah, sure. The great discontent in Guyana today is a direct result of politics and policies. Presently, you will find that most of the contracts that have been awarded, that are currently being awarded for rehabilitation of roads, schools, hospitals, renovation, new constructions, are given by this government to a huge preponderance of Indo-Guyanese people. The legislation should be that a certain percentage of contracts should be given to minorities, women, Amerindians, just like we have in New York City here, where immigrants and women that comprise minority contractors and are part of the service sector must by law be given contracts. So when we look at the discontent in Guyana, people express their discontent in a huge spectrum of methods. And the latest outburst by Mr. Ogunsi is not that I agree with him, but one has to understand why these things happen. It's because when you go to the seat of decision making in Guyana, the parliament, nobody has any say in parliament. Parliament has been controlled by the party in power since Ghana has become an independent country. The previous parliament will shut down any bill that the PPP would have proposed. Currently, the present Speaker of the House makes up the 34th member of the PPP. That's the way he behaves. Every bill is shut down by Mr. Nadir. Mr. Nadir cannot allow the most important bill of any politician to be debated. That's the bill regarding oil and gas. It's a $2 billion project, the most expensive project ever.
Just to interrupt, you're saying it's because of discontentment against the government that led to these outbursts from the two speakers. So can you first address what the speaker said and your response to them, and then you could talk
about the resentment. The resentment is an economic one because they find that their Indian counterparts are getting all the contracts and they're not getting any. They don't get their voices heard in parliament. The speaker shuts you down. And just to address Mr. Timothy here, we have come from various parts of India and Africa, but I say this everywhere I go. It doesn't matter where you come from. What matters where you're going. Jesus Christ was born in a stable. That doesn't make him a donkey. Everyone in Ghana can go somewhere if the conditions are right. But coming back to the actual topic, right? How to foster social cohesion. The issue is one of a communication nature as well. In democratic countries, you will find people direct their leaders what to do. In a country like Guyana, like China, North Korea, Cuba, and all of these dictatorship, tyrannical countries, Russia included, leaders dictate to the people what should happen. Guyana has fallen into the latter category. That is why we will have so much resentment in that country. On the issue of race, we could go on and talk about race. Race is the most important factor in a person's life because when you look at me and I look at you, you don't see a wealthy man or a healthy man or a man who is a Christian or a Hindu. The first thing you see is an Indian man or an African Guyanese or a Chinese. That's the first thing you see. So my point to Mr. Blackman and Mr. Jonas is that racism cannot be curbed by any form of legislation, right? Just like democracy cannot be obtained by legislation, but it must evolve as a culture. So let me just say this again. Democracy cannot be obtained by legislation, but it must evolve as a culture from the people. Nelson Mandela. Over.
Okay, so a lack of or a restricted democracy and a lack of opportunities, you feel resulted or caused the two speakers to utter the kind of remarks that they made.
They feel ostracized, left out, shunted aside, uncared for. What Mr. Ogunsi, first of all, his real name is is Colin Young. I know Mr. Ogunsi personally. In 1994, 2 years after the PPP government took office, we had a meeting at the United States Embassy, in which Mr. Kit Nascimento made the lead presentation. And I made a little presentation, but Mr. Ogunsi indicated because of ethnic voting in Guyana, the only way we can guarantee security of both races is to import African people, mostly from the Caribbean, so we have an equal amount of Africans and Guyanese in the country. That speech is recorded for record if you need to go back to there. So the issue in Guyana, like I said, is not racism in as much as it's theft. And theft has become so institutionalized to the point where it's a norm of society. The abnormal has been practiced so often, it's been taken as a norm. And one of the greatest areas of theft in the country, I'm not going to mention police force taking bribe. That's been there forever. That's been there forever since the PNC days in the early 70s. Theft of people's rights, theft of people's property, and most of all, theft of people's voices. The media in the country that is supposed to be state-owned should be state-owned, not PNC-owned or PPP-owned. When the Chronicle was in, today the Chronicle is an extension of the PPP. Likewise, it was an extension of the PNC in the previous government. My point is, if people are to develop in Guyana, they need economic development and opportunities that are created so people to develop themselves will, by and large, absorb any racial imbalances that you will have. United States is a prime example where Barack Obama became the president. That's enough to show that there is opportunity for people to get to the highest platform anywhere in society.
Professor Blackman, you would like to comment on Leyland Roopnarine's views, and of course, add to your own.
So I would say this. I understand very clearly the sense that if one is frustrated, if one feels sort of, economic resentment, if one feels that one is unable to communicate in the political sphere, that this should create some kind of urgency, in the political sphere. But I still think, and I think this is very important for us. Look, we've just come from, and I think we should all put the thing on the table. We've just come out of a situation where there was a no confidence vote, and there was a huge months went by before Guyanese could reasonably say that 33 was the majority of 65. It took going to the Caribbean Court of Justice to establish this, right? And then having established this, we then had an election. And that election, as you all know, ended up in a complete fiasco. Even today, we still, there are people who don't feel that they lost the election, people who, look, I mean, the votes were recounted by the folks from CARICOM. And even today, folks are unwilling to sort of stand up and say, you know what, we lost the election. And so I think that if you're in a system, and that is the key marker that determines how you affect the transfer of power, you have to affirm it. And if you're a political player, you have to say, this democracy it might not be perfect as Mr. Roopnarine has, described. Maybe the Speaker of the House. I don't know the Speaker of the House. I don't know the operations. I don't know the manner in which he decides which matters get debated or not debated. But maybe let's take for granted. Let's assume for that it's true that the Speaker of the House, as you put it, operates like the 34th member in the. Let's say that's true. But he is still the Speaker of the House, right? There's still a political process that we've all agreed to. So I think when someone says, let's inveigle the army to engage in some extra political action, that we should all say, okay, regardless of what our position is on the levels of frustration and so on, which we will get to, we should all say, look, no, maybe we don't want to go down that path. Let's close that door. Now we can argue about your statement about, the structural demographics of the electorate, that, Afro-Guyanese unfortunately have less, and therefore in any, demographic vote, it's not democracy, it's demography. But I still think we have to take that too with a grain of salt, and to say, and this is again to say, is it possible? And that's, I'm just saying that as a question for consideration. The APNU AFC won the 2015 election, and so whatever you think of this actually did happen. There was a free and fair election, and the APNU AFC won. So to say that, you can never again win in the future, and to use that as a sort of stalking horse for saying, let's break up the democracy, I think is perhaps not the right path. But again, I say this with some distance from, I don't live this every single day. Right? It's not my voice that is being critiqued. So, but I just think as we look long term for the future of Guyana, I think we have to say, well, maybe I'll let Mr. Jonas speak, because it seems to me that
okay.
But my point is, I think we have to say that democracy is important, and and we can't countenance the sort of disregard of the democracy and the open flirtation with potential violence.
Okay, so the speakers did not give any reasons for their loud outbursts. So we are just speculating what may have caused them to say what they did, which is what Leyland did.
I stipulate that that's. I mean, I stipulate that. Let's assume that that's true. So even if that's true, and I was extremely frustrated. It's like we just had this in the United States, right? Some people were extremely frustrated about an election, and they went to the Congress and they destroyed some aspects of it. And those people are being, those people are being prosecuted, right? So I think if you have a democracy, you have to be able to say that it is a democracy, and that some things we ought to rule out of bounds of the democracy. Now, but is that a shared Guyanese value? Is that a value that we all share? Is that something that we all agree that is essential for us going forward? And I think that, that was the open question, and things sort of broke down there. And it seems to be breaking down here again. So, I think we should all sort of commit to saying democracy is important.
If I may add to Mr. Blackman, the January 6th riots did not only result in people being prosecuted, about a dozen have begun serving their jail sentences. So we await the Commission of Inquiry into Guyana's election fiasco. What's going to happen to that Commission of Inquiry? And who's going to go to jail? So far, in my adult life, no public official in Guyana has ever gone to jail for any reason, whether it's rape, theft, election fraud, whatever crime they have committed, let me tell you, including homicide, they have never gone to jail.
Mr. Leyland is making very, very strong statements. So
no
let's hear.
Has ever gone to jail in Guyana.
Let's hear from the senior counsel.
You're muted.
Turn the guns in the right direction.
Okay.
So there is a right direction to turn the guns. And you and the police and army outnumber them. Now, it's only race this man was talking about. And the only difference about outnumbering was saying that the people in the armed forces that look like me outnumber the people in the armed forces that look like the other folk. And then he says, turn the guns in the right direction. So he is advocating the use of guns of deadly force in the right direction against your oppressors who he defines and delineates along racial lines. You know, it doesn't get worse than that, does it? We have a generation in Guyana, of which he is a part of. He's a part of that generation that lived through serious issues in the 60s and has seen sporadic violence in Guyana since then. Now, the irony is that, let's face the reality, when we have had violence in any village in Guyana, whether it was at Buxton or when the Henry boys were killed and it was up in Dartmouth, Essequibo, when the folks came down the East Coast the other day and stopped at Lusignan Market, it is actions by Afro-Guyanese where most of the victims are Indo-Guyanese. Let's face that hard truth. And if anyone challenges me on that, I really want to see their face. So we have a pattern in Guyana that when there is unrest, you have, whether it's looting or assault or sexual assault or whatever it is, it has been predominantly in that pattern. The irony is that the poor in Guyana, whether they are Afro-Guyanese or Indo-Guyanese, their lot has not improved because the government has been the Indo-ethnic party or the Afro-ethnic party. They have remained oppressed. They remain oppressed whether or not the government looks like them. But you still have these power-seeking rabble-rousers who believe that the only way to galvanize support is on grounds of racial hate and therefore seek to consolidate that ethnic force, as was done on that platform, because he has nothing else. He cannot show leadership. He cannot show innovative ideas. He cannot show economic progress. He cannot show anything along the lines of a policy, whether it is health, whether it's education, whether it is societal development, that he or his party has done to help. And therefore, this is what he does. Fortunately, Guyana is changing. We've been stuck in a time warp. We got people from that generation who are spewing that poison and continuing to spew that poison. Fortunately, they're getting older. They're leaving the scene one at a time. And the newer generation, the youngsters, who, as Guyana is getting more affluent, they're traveling a bit more. They're seeing alternatives on television, YouTube, social media. They're seeing what is possible out there. They're seeing that the horizon aren't this ugly tug of war between two groups. They are interchanging, they are interacting, they are more open, they are more receptive. They are embracing what the ideal is that I think Guyana can achieve. And they don't have time for that foolishness. And I'm seeing that in the younger generation, and that is what's giving me hope. That man did himself no favors. I haven't spoken to a single person who listened to that garbage, and said, yes, that's right. And when people talk about frustration, well, whose frustration are you talking about? Can you point me to a single poor Guyanese, Afro or Indo, who can say, I have been helped by the policies of my government when in power? No, the oppression is absolute and continuous. So let's try to justify along frustration that we're excluded economically, when that exclusion has taken place all along, regardless of who is in power. That's barefaced racism, and call it what it is. And let us move away from it, reject it, condemn it, and hope that as the new generation with their more liberal views and their more holistic approach take over gradually and become the moving force in our society, that we have a better approach in the future.
A new open society could lead to greater social cohesion. You agree, Professor Terrence Blackman?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think this is where I'm going, which is to say that you have to do things that will foster an open society, do things that will foster some dependence on data and rational and objective arguments, so that people are not reflexively put in the situation of having to make tribal choices rather than to make actual policy choices. And that's sort of where it's clear that that's the direction that we have to be going. The issue is how to do the kinds of things that Leyland talked about in the policy sense. You know, he raised the question of, you know, the distribution of contracts, say, for example, and the preponderance of contracts that go to Indo-Guyanese as opposed. So, and he raised the issue of that folks here in New York are quite familiar with, that there are, you know, the New York state government has a clear directive around supporting minority and businesses that are owned by minorities and women. And so there's a model for us. The issue is that we can't adopt a New York model and put it into Guyana in the same way, because the history of what it means to say minority and women and all of these require a sort of filtering through Guyanese lens. But it's that kind of discussion that we need to have about, okay, there are inequalities, and this was the point in the era of oil and gas. If it is that you're going to only give, you know, it's not. I think often when I hear people have this conversation, it's almost if someone is saying, well, you know, there's someone sitting there someplace and they're saying, like, we're going to only give these contracts to Indian contractors. There's a system. People bid. There's a procurement process. People bid. You know, who are the people who are so. It's a process that requires a certain kind of education about what that procurement process looks like, and then begins to ask, how do we find ways to affirmatively ensure that there are more people from the various ethnic groups, as Leyland noted, Amerindians, Afro-Guyanese, women who are a part of this process, right? In that way, we empower the broad masses of the society, and perhaps, as you know, we kind of take the edge off some of the racial contestation, and we move a bit closer to social cohesion. So those are the kinds of conversations that I think we need to be having. So if they're, how do we define, you know, as Timothy Jonas just noted, you know, the poor have stayed poor under the PPP, they've stayed poor under the PNC. So, you know, their oppression is independent of the particular political parties. Now, knowing that, how do we quantify this is what's going on, and to be able to set sort of goals for ourselves as a society? How do we raise, how do we raise the number of folks who live in poverty above a certain, across the board? How do we make sort of investments in, how do we use this sort of money to make investments in, like the national insurance scheme, when something like this came in, everyone complained about it. But today, people travel from the US who are pensioners to go to Guyana who have paid into the system. I mean, we might be doing things for, putting monies in accounts for children as they're born across Guyana that will mature when they get to 18 years old or something. Those are the kinds of conversations I think we need to be having. But in order to have those conversations, we need to have a sense of being in a shared space. And so we need to be concerned with issues like with voices like the voices that were raised, even if in frustration, and I give you that, even if they're raised in frustration, the sentiments that they express have no part in the modern sort of democratic Guyana that we're trying to see birthed.
As Timothy stated, those sentiments, they were stuck in the 60s. I mean, they really don't belong. I mean, those persons were not realistic. I don't think they've been living in Guyana over the last several years or over the last decade. Guyana has been changing. You know, it's evolving. In fact, it's evolving very, very rapidly. It's not the Guyana of the 1960s. People get along more frequently now than they did in the 60s, in terms of ethnic relations and social relations. Timothy, you agree or disagree? It looks like you want to make a statement.
I do agree, Vish, but I don't want to give this man the excuse that there's some kind of frustration because others are getting contracts. It's true that the contracts are being awarded right now predominantly to one side. It's true, and I can get into that if you wish. But he's not a contractor, so his frustration isn't personal to him, and he's not speaking on behalf of some contractors who have bid and been refused. He is rabble-rousing. So this pretended frustration about economic exclusion, no. The majority of the supporters of APNU, who are Afro-Guyanese and living in those villages and are voting along ethnic lines rather than policies, don't receive contracts, don't bid for contracts, are not part of that game. They do not benefit economically when APNU is in. They do not lose economically when APNU is out. Their lives remain tough. They are oppressed by both parties. So this frustration along economic lines is a myth. It is invented. It is an excuse introduced by racists to support and justify a racist statement, and it needs to be rejected. If we want to have a discussion about equal opportunity along economic lines and about making opportunities available on both sides, let's do it, because there is unfairness in the allocation by the government, by the PPP government in these days and by the previous government in their day as they were growing. There is unfairness right now, but that has nothing to do with a man who is not a contractor and never bid for contracts going and said we got to turn the guns in the right direction. His frustration is the frustration of a politician who has been excluded from power and is rabble-rousing using the only leverage he has left, and demonstrating to us that he is a product of his generation and a product of his environment and needs to retire.
Mm-hmm. Leyland, Roopnarine.
Well, in another 2 months, Ghana will celebrate 58 years of independence. And through that, we have found a lot of good ideas from our leaders that have all gone onto the rocks. They have been misplaced and they have lacked fruit. They have never come to fruition and they have never achieved what their intended purposes were. We could start with the Yarokabo glass factory under Bornum, the Mahaika, the MMA hydro project under Bornum, the Skeleton factory under Jagdale, and we could go on and on, right? But recently, Guyana's government has entered into an e-card production with, I think it's a German company under the guidance of Sheikh Al Maktoum of the United Arab Emirates. Now, a few days ago, Al Maktoum was deemed an abuser by the British court in order to pay his wife some £500 million in a divorce settlement. That, I think, is his fourth wife. I don't know why our country, one of the poorest in the world, we haven't gotten the oil wealth distributors yet, is going to one of the richest countries in the world for advice. There's a huge gap there. We have a country where we're going to issue EID cards, which has to be extracted from the National Registration Center, which cannot produce a proper voters list up to now. And there are 200 people, 200,000 persons on the voters list that are not supposed to be there, dead or migrated or non-existent. So where are we going with this e-card? We have an idea that is good, but it's misplaced. We're not yet ready yet for that. It's like going to Plastic City and putting in a jacuzzi in someone's house and expect the whole area to become a better place. It's a misplaced improvement and it's totally inappropriate at this junction in Ghana's history. Listen, we have a country where we are called the land of many waters, and we are importing water to drink. We are importing water to drink. Then we are smuggling chicken. Last year, chicken was found in an ambulance, and I understand the chicken was smuggled on the behest of a very high-ranking PPP official in Region 6. And we could go on and on to talk about misplaced spending. What we need here in order to have, as we say, social cohesion is people must feel The idea is that they must feel that their needs are being attended to. The perception of being victimized makes you act as a victim. The perception is greater than the actuality. As the great Lord Acton said, justice delayed is justice denied. And if you're going to delay improving people's area, it's going to create a snowball effect where crime is going to dominate that particular community, and drugs. Because right now, Guyana has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. We may not have done a study, but Guyana has one of the highest alcoholic addiction in the world. So we have a situation where we are misplacing our monies, just like the Surrender Hospital, I have a little insight about the Surrender Hospital, where he was supposed to get a bond, I think $200 million bond, so that he could have gotten the contract. So Surrender produced a bond, and our learned Attorney General and our great bankers did not examine the bond, and it turned out that the bond was fake. There was no such bond that existed, and Surrender walked away with a couple $100 million. And nobody could find the Surrender now, and the hospital is lying there. And the steel that was there, that was imported by Surrender to build the hospital, was picked up by a certain PNC henchman. These are all public knowledge, but people don't want to talk about it. So coming back to this issue of social cohesion.
Yeah. Relate what you said to social cohesion, please.
Social cohesion. These are all spin-offs of a lack of social cohesion, because if there is economic development, people will not find time to argue over trivial things. They will focus on their own personal development, then they go to the development of the community, and then they go to the secondary needs and tertiary needs of development. Right now, what Guyana needs in order to curb the excessive spending and the excessive theft of the state funds, and I say this again, this all doesn't belong to Mr. Granger, Mr. Jagdi, or Mr. Nagamutu, and Mr. Ali. This all belongs to the people of Guyana. It is the people's wealth, and you have no right as the government of Guyana to spend the wealth as you see fit. It is not your money that you're spending. You're spending people's money. You have to be accountable for the people. Yet we have people who are riding that country like the Colossus of Rhodes, like how Barnum used to ride his horse and people used to jump in the trench. We have the same thing going on in Guyana in a different form. Well, the only thing is they're not riding horses, they're driving Prado. The point is, unless you have an oversight committee that monitors the awarding of contracts and the expenditure of state funds, Guyana will not see any progress, because right now the government of this day or the previous government could have spent money, and no one could have told them not to spend such money, because it's a term that I will coin as the tyranny of the majority. When you have a majority in parliament, you are free to spend, you're free to steal, you're free to commit whatever crime you want with impunity, because you control the judiciary and the police force, you control the speaker of the parliament. Where are we going with this social cohesion? We have to put a stop, and we have to put a stop real soon, before all our oil wealth will disappear, and we will end up like Venezuela. A massive amount of oil wealth just vanished because of poor governmental policies. And that's what every single Guyanese should be worried about. They shouldn't be worried about who is Indian and who is black. They should be worried who is stealing their money. That's why Mr. Glenlal of Kaichur News has a very, very valid point. The oil contract needs to be renegotiated, and the PPP did campaign on that premise of renegotiating this oil contract. Which part of the world do you get 12.5% of what is yours? It's not only an atrocity, it's an idiotic mindset of anyone who says this contract should not be negotiated. Furthermore,
so Leyland, we're jumping from one thing to the other. Let's yeah.
Social cohesion will only come about when you have economic opportunities for every single Guyanese, and the economic opportunities must commensurate with educational opportunities. What we find in Guyana now is that And I made this to Dr. Jagan a long time ago. We are teaching our people how to go into the mines and dig. Instead of teaching them to be miners, we are teaching them how to work for miners. Instead of teaching them to establish independent sugar processing facility like India, India has a lot of facilities that simply extract the juice out of the sugar and sell the juice in sugar factories. We are teaching people to cut cane. I have never seen such gross stupidity where a government is telling people we shall revive the sugar industry and go back to cut cane. You came here to cut cane 200 years ago. Are you going to go back to that? We don't see black people in America going back to sharecropping and picking cotton. That's a retrograde backward step to tell people to go and cut cane when you're producing sugar at 35 cents a pound and the world market price is 16 to 18 cents per pound. That is gross stupidity of any government who thinks sugar is going to be successful in that country. So social cohesion has to do with within an economic framework. We don't have a proper economic policy up now. We just simply point our finger in any direction where we see there's some amount of money to be spent, and we go ahead and spend it. That's why you will see the Gas Assure project that's going to cost $2 billion, up from $1 billion 3 years ago, is going to end up like the Skeldon Sugar Factory.
So Professor Blackman.
No, so I want to defer to Mr. Jonas here, because
okay,
I think these very I mean, I want to make a larger point in some sense, but I can't respond to the sort of the local granular things.
So he's saying that very bad policy making and terrible expenditures are the main factors that lead to a lack of social cohesion in Guyana. So
I can agree with. I can certainly agree that if you have a bad sort of policy sort of framework, then this, as is rightly identified, if the perception of what is happening is one that goes against me, and in some cases it actually goes against me, then there's a clear sense that this moves us away from being a more connected and being a society of trust. If I think that every time you do one of these projects, it's not really about the broader community, but it's about simply, you and the contractors have an inside game, then it's hard to engender the kind of it's hard for me to put my heart and soul into it. So, I hear what you're saying, but I can't respond to, the smuggling of chicken or, this kind of thing. I mean, these things have happened, and again, there might be small things that lead to people thinking, well, if the official policy on chicken is to support the local people who are growing, to help them to do their pens effectively, to help them to do things so that they can manage the increasing temperatures that kill chicks, and to really help with the chicken husbandry policies, and then someone else is on the outside breaking the rules up and importing them from somewhere else where they're not handling what's happening locally. Certainly that moves to undermining the sense of cohesion in the system. So I agree with that, but I'm only saying that these are, in a way, facts that I don't have a handle on, in the sense that I don't know, the particular machinations of what actually is happening in the parliament, that, how the speaker decides which bill comes first and which bill comes second, and whether or not the opposition is not a part of this process. And, I don't know how effectively, and this is where I think we have to look for some transparency, look for some broad rules that work that someone can look at it and say, this is what's happening. Guyana is a diverse country. It's got a mix of ethnic groups, it's got a mix of religions, cultures, right? So the social cohesion's got to maintain the peace, it's got to maintain the stability, and it takes on a much sharper tenor in this context of the oil and gas, right? Everyone feels that someone is getting something and they're not getting it. And so, as Mr. Roopnarine, there's in his words theft, right? I mean, I don't want to say I don't have any evidence that anyone is stealing anything. If a man wins a contract or a company wins a contract, they won the contract. They haven't stolen anything from anyone. But if the game by which the contract is being awarded is rigged, then this is something for us to have a discussion about. So I don't want to say, I don't want to characterize what's happening as theft. But I want to say that if we look at the outcomes, these are not the outcomes that we want. Then we begin to ask, what do we want to change to and how to cause that change? And it's that conversation that I think we want to have. At least
I endorse your perspective on it. But look, I don't think any government, and certainly not the government of Guyana, tells people, even if they're very, very supportive of the government, go and steal chicken, go and smuggle chicken or alcohol or anything else and bring it into Guyana to make money. I mean, these kind of law-breaking activities do happen across any society, and it's something that's very difficult to regulate. And when evidence come forward, I think government does take necessary measures to restore order. But let's hear from the lawyer, the senior counsel. What he thinks about all of this.
Certainly, there are a number of cushions that can be introduced that help people to get along better. I can't get into all the anecdotal events cited by my friend Leyland. He went on a rampage there. So I'm not going to try with that at all. And I won't thank Terrence either for allocating to me the responsibility of responding. but okay. In terms of fairness and transparency, let's start there. If you are going to look for social cohesion, the first thing you got to look for is, the ancient Greeks said it. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they all recognized it. That if a man has a house and he has his family and he has enough assets that he needs to protect, he's not going to run out there and riot, and he's not going to be getting into problems and finding himself in jail. So you have to have an environment where your citizens are affluent enough, are comfortable enough, have enough fat on them that they don't feel the urge to go running up the road every time there's a riot. All right. If you are comfortable and you like the car you drive and you can take your family on a holiday every now and then, chances are you're going to be friendly with your neighbor, whatever your neighbor looks like, especially if your neighbor's also got a nicely painted house and you feel nice living next door to that neighbor. So we saw it in Trinidad, which has the same demographic as us. And yet their society has evolved since independence, got independence around the same time as us, in a much more sophisticated, much more self-sufficient, and much less brutish way than us. Let us be frank about it. What's the difference between us and them? The difference is money. They became affluent, and they had that pride and that self-respect and that stature that little bit of money brings. So they go on trips and they're nice and middle class and they have picnics and they meet socially and all of that, while we were struggling under a destroyed economy in the 80s and 90s. And that absence of that cushion, that tooth and claw necessity that we had, smuggling in cheese, buying flour on the black market, learning to live below the radar so that the police don't see you doing this, the customs don't see you doing that, learning to break the law. That hard, rough edge that we had just to get by, lining up for oil and toilet paper. When you are living in those dire circumstances, you do not have the luxury of adding cushions so that you can be charitable or gracious or benevolent. You don't have that. You withdraw, and our society became hard. And one aspect of that was an intolerance and a knee-jerk reaction to any kind of hostility. Affluence helps that, and we are seeing that as members in the society are becoming more affluent. They're driving their cars. The housing scheme of the government has has done wonders. They're living in houses, less rental. And you are seeing, especially in the younger generation that is accustomed to this new lifestyle, a more embracing, more tolerant approach to interaction. So that's one thing. But how do you help to get your society to be more economically secure, more economically happy and self-sufficient? My friend Leyland is right. One of the things is you got to stop giving contracts to your family and friends. Now, Terrence had kind of dismissed that by saying that there's a system. And in this regard, I want to respectfully disagree with you. There is a system, yes, but the system is not fair. I can give you several examples. There is a process recognized in the Act for inviting quotations. And in an attempt to ensure that more than one contractor is invited, a minimum of 3. You gotta, if you're building a wharf in Pomeroon, minimum of 3. But the easy solution to that, if you're the chairman there in Pomeroon, is your neighbor is invited to bid. And then the other 2 contractors who are invited to bid come from quarantine, so that their costs will be moving machinery, moving personnel, moving everything from quarantine to Pomeroon, and they can't compete. Now, we've seen that happen. So there is a way to rig a system. Another thing you see is that the pre-qualification criteria change ad hoc in ways that are unimaginable. So whereas there was a time where if you breached the contract, if you had previous breaches of contracts and judgments awarded against you, that counted against you. That has evolved now. And we know that there may be breaches of contract if you're awarded a contract. You may take too long, you may delay, but your employer might also be wrong, so that you may have to make a claim against your employer. And that pre-qualification has now evolved so that even if you sue your employer, you're now disqualified. Imagine that, not a proved case, not a judgment, a claim, and not a claim by them against you, by you against them, counts against you in the pre-qualification. So the pre-qualification pattern is being rigged, is being adjusted, and can be adjusted in an ad hoc manner, so that you're out in the cold. And you're seeing that favoritism, and you're seeing some ordinary folk get very wealthy. You're seeing contracts awarded where the mobilization fee, the advance fee is 30% the value of the contract. Imagine that. So that a man with nothing, and we've seen that, contractors who have no previous experience, no machinery, no background, win a contract and can buy machinery, can get off the ground because of that generous and unrealistic advance. It's rigged. And the way to get around that is transparency. Put some new folk on that procurement board. Not done. No way. No way, no how. So lack of transparency. Therefore, the ability to manipulate the tendering process, the pre-qualification process, the award of contract process. And that's just one example. And that absence of transparency is creating grievances. Unless we can get that right, unless we can have true inclusivity, we got issues. And this actually goes back to something you'd said earlier about the democracy, the democratic process that we all agree to live in. Well, here's the thing. I've heard people say, oh, you respect the outcome, and you have to respect the outcome because the alternative is burnout. And that is unacceptable. You cannot have a dictator running you through rigged elections and keeping himself in power. But if our reality is that 50% of the population vote one way and 50% of the population vote another way, then the democratic result must be that one party has nearly 50% of the say in governmental decisions, and the other party has slightly more than 50% of the say in governmental decisions, has a presence on governmental boards, has a presence on commissions. Right now, that 50-50 leads to 100 and 0, which is what Leyland was saying earlier. And I didn't agree to that. I was born and found myself in that. But I think we can fix that. I think that can be fixed in a way that is lawful, in a way that is evolutionary, and in a way that solves the problem. But it needs a third party.
So we are running short of time. We just have like about 13 minutes left, and I wanted to discuss really the solutions, because we have talked about the problems, and if we could address some of the solutions. Leyland, do you think we can have a solution to this quote unquote racial problem, ethnic problem, racial conflict, ethnic conflict in Guyana, in order to have social cohesion or greater social cohesion?
The racial problems in Guyana are like flooding and fire. We can never stop them. We can prevent the damaging effects of such elements, fire, flooding. Racism is here to stay, whether it's in Guyana or the world. People have this innate, inborn feeling of being suspicious and being uncomfortable with another race. That's why interracial marriages are like about what, 1% of the world population goes into interracial marriages. But like I said, we could curb the harmful effects of racism. One of the ways of doing this is to have, as they say, you start at the start and you start at the starting. Our school system has to be so integrated that every school should have half the teachers being, I'm not saying half literally speaking, but you can't have a school in an Indian area have shared Indian teachers, because by virtue of the fact that the Indian teachers live close by, they are seconded to that school. The school should have a balanced staff of both Indian and Black teachers and other races too. In that way, students and teachers could interact with their different values. And we're not talking education here alone, because education is of no use if you cannot direct it to good use. There are many educated people in jail. There are many educated people who are deadly thieves throughout the world, Ghana included. So we need to have what you call a cultural education as well, not just an academic education. And I'll say this, on the issue of social cohesion. Social cohesion means living in harmony with society. Society following independence from the British was founded on 3 pillars. It was the judiciary, the public service, and the military. Military, judiciary, public service. If we need social cohesion, we need to balance the military and the discipline services in Guyana. Hypothetically speaking, if there is any disgruntlement in the other side, in the other camp, and they decide to appeal to the army, as recently WPA henchmen have done, right? And the army decides to accept and go along with them, Indian people in Guyana will be wiped off the map, because they don't have access to any form of defense. The military and all the paramilitary and discipline services are directly lined up against Indian people. Let's put it very simple to you. That's why that's why Walter Rodney was saying, the God rest his soul, that in the late 70s, when Guyana is in dire economic straits, when people were lining up, as Timothy said, for oil and flour at a place called Knowledge Shared Institute. What a name for a place to get a pint of oil. Rodney mentioned that why is Bornholm created so much paramilitary service, national service, national guard service, people's militia, tactical service unit, national, and we can go on and on, people's protection services, property protection services, and why is he creating these things? Because he wanted to keep the entire Guyana, not just Indian people, the entire Guyana in subjection. He wanted them to be fearful so that he would cement himself in power. And remember this, his Bornholm's protege, who became president, David Granger, appointed Cornel Harmon as his right hand, Minister of the Presidency. The Guyana Public Hospital Corporation had an ex-army personnel as his head. The Consul General of New York had a female whose husband was in the military. They had us so cool. Mr. Hettimaya was in the military. I mean, we could go on and on with this. Are we saying that he was following in the footsteps of his mentor, born with militarizing Guyana? You see, if you want to talk social cohesion, which goes on hand in hand with race in Guyana, I'll tell you this. We had social cohesion problems long before independence. We had it in the Wilsmar massacre. We had it in the Rose Hall massacre, right? We had after that the Enmore massacre, the Enmore martyrs. But these issues pale in comparison to the systematic destruction to the point where it became genocide of Indian people, because Indian people were always the victims of the Kignon bandits that was headed by the House of Israel thugs. It was proven that when Mr. Hart came to power, Rabbi Washington was charged for more than he was jailed. The House of Israel thugs were very, very clear to that. And I don't see, right, I have never seen a Chinese person loot a store. I've never seen an Amerindian person loot a store. I have never seen an Indian person loot a store. It's only one race of people that loot. And when you look at the George Floyd protests in New York and throughout America, these protests are a means, are what you call a pretext. It's a stepping stone to looting. And I was personally present in Manhattan when I saw these things, tears came to my, what these people did to the stores. The stores, the BMW store, Saks Fifth Avenue, Macy's, J.C. Penney, The Gap, they destroyed these storefronts and this breaking the glass in the storefront. They got an arm full of clothes. It's all on video. It's all public knowledge. So many people look at protests, which you have a right to protest, but many people look at protests as a means of personal enhancement. But that's only one issue. Then the issue came up in 1992 when President Hoyt, who had lost the election, declared he would make Guyana ungovernable. I will make this country ungovernable. Why would you say that? You are a Guyanese and you want to make Guyana ungovernable. Now, 30 years later, you have Takuma Ogunsi saying this something very similar. We shall take over this government. And, you know, then we can go on to a whole lot of very sour issues that people underwent in Guyana. 1997, when the PPP was returned into office, Hart came up with a slogan, slow fire, more fire. Who you think were the victims of these outbursts? You want to talk race? Let's talk race, man. We can talk race right now here. We all know, right, that the 2001 jailbreak, where these criminals were sheltered in Boston, and
Leyland, we just got a few minutes. Let's hear from the others. But let me interject. There is legitimate protests in the United States, given the treatment of minorities, African Americans and others, and they didn't go out at a protest in order to break and loot. I mean, yes, you're right. Some of them were involved and engaged in that, but there were legitimate reasons for protests because of the violation of their rights. Professor Blackman, we only have a few minutes, so you want to respond to that and let's summarize?
So maybe I'd start there. I think, just to suggest to Leyland that, again, we come to the end of the program and we're back to this question of the dignity of democracy. I think, as an African American, anyone who looked at the video of that officer kneeling on the neck of George Floyd in Minnesota,
horrible.
In Minneapolis, Minnesota, understands clearly why there was a global uprising around. So perhaps it's not appropriate to characterize that as a sort of situation where, some Afro-Americans and others decided to loot. It had absolutely nothing to do with looting. This was a response to a clear violation of human dignity. We saw a man being executed on the street, and the courts in Minnesota sort of ruled similarly. And this was one incident of this type, and we've seen many incidences like this. Most recently, just yesterday or so, I was watching 60 Minutes, where a young man was killed in Virginia in a mental health home, right? So this question of dignity and how one responds when one's dignity is violated in some is a very important one. And I think as we've had this conversation this evening, and as we've thought about strategies for social cohesion, these things remain. And so perhaps in my closing thought, I just want us to continue to encourage kind of a dialogue like we're having now, right? So it's okay for people to sort of put on the record the things that have animated them. I mean, I was just remembering, I completely forgotten you mentioned the KSI, and I thought, God damn it, I can't remember. I've just remembered the KSI, this knowledge sharing institute where people would go for things. So I want us to encourage the dialogue and the engagement. As you've rightly noted, Leyland, continue to invest in education, continue to figure out how to make these networks work. As Timothy is, we have to address this issue of inequality and discrimination, but we have to do it in a manner that is not sort of fighting with each other, but it's sort of saying, here's how we fashion a future together, right? And in that same context, as you've described, the fostering the economic development, and I think this is where I come down, we have to find ways to more rapidly than we're doing now in this era, foster economic development that is broadly shared. And if we don't have economic development that is broadly shared, this is where things will break down. And in that context, I think we also have to think about these cultural elements that have just been described. I mean, I don't want to relitigate WISMA and all of these. I think for me, the point is to pivot to the future. And so we have to think about ways in which we affirm our various cultural diversities that are part of. And then finally, I submit we have to think about this question that has arisen about the institutions, about just strengthening the institutions, the courts, the military, the procurement agencies are universal. So how do we strengthen the institutions so that they act in a manner that is perceived fair, in a manner that is fair? But we have to have some conversation about what is fair for us in our context. And I hope that we can continue to do that. Look, Guyana is a complicated place. We all know that. What we're arguing for is hard. We know that. People get upset, and then when they get upset, they walk out the room. We know that. But so we have to have some commitment just to each other, to, at the end of the day, encouraging the conversation and the engagement and the willingness to have people be able to say what's on their mind and to be able to listen to what's on someone else's mind. So, I'll pause there, and, we'll pick this discussion up as we go forward.
Timothy, Jonas, Senior Counsel, final thoughts?
Well, Leland had a moment of honesty there where he started before you interrupted him, Vishnu. And let me say I agree with him entirely to the point that Terrence raised. We cannot compare Guyana to the States, where there is a systematic and clearly visible policy that oppresses a minority race. What happened after that incident that Terrence described and the process that resulted, I think were obviously justified and obviously necessary, and they have to do some serious introspection in that country and fix their systems, because there is a system of discrimination and oppression that is unacceptable. So I'm going to leave that alone. But insofar as you speak to the incidents of violence and looting in Guyana, I agree with you that those incidents have victims that all look one way. And that is true, it's undeniable. But when you segue into the police, I want to respectfully point out to you that despite what the speaker said about pointing guns in the right direction, in my experience, 97 more fire, 2001 foolishness, Bartica, Buxton, Agricola, the police have never demonstrated any indication to line up with the kind of racist rabble-rousing we saw. They have acted, and the army, they have acted professionally and with restraint and have never been involved since independence, since 1992, in the low-level rabble-rousing or the conflict that some of these folk are trying to raise up. And I think that that needs to be observed and commended and acknowledged, because the professionalism that they've shown is one of the reasons that we are still in order as a society and still exist as a society. And that needs to be said, and they need to be congratulated for it. Congratulated is too strong a word. It's expected of them, but it needs to be acknowledged that they have acted professionally. Now, going forward, we have to identify where the problem is and where the solution is. And I think the first problem is these self-serving politicians who want to jump on that bandwagon in the hope of getting some kind of leverage. And we need to reject them. And the solution is fair governance, transparent governance, inclusive governance for everybody. And you have said that throughout this program. I'm not going to get to the anecdotal incidents. I think we're all agreed on that front. And I would leave it at that for now. It's been an interesting conversation.
Thank you very much. Leyland, it looks like you have another 30 seconds. You have anything else to say? I just want to end the program.
You're muted, Leyland. You're muted.
Well, I don't think we'll be able to hear Leyland. So I just want to thank you all very much.
Thank you.
For taking the time out of your. Yeah, Leyland. Okay, so let me thank you all very much for taking your very precious time away from what your regular routine activities, for joining us here, and let's continue this conversation. I think it's a very, very interesting conversation. The perspectives, I do not agree with all of them, and I don't think some of them are well supported with evidence. But nevertheless, Leyland offered a lot of anecdotes for us to examine in future conversations. Thank you all again, and good night.